What if I told you that survival isn't about the gear you carry, or the skills you've memorized from YouTube videos? What if real survival is about something much deeper? The kind of mental toughness that lets you stare death in the face and keep moving forward anyway. Today, I'm going to tell you a story about a time when men lived by their wits alone, when a single mistake could mean freezing to death in a mountain valley, and when the wilderness didn't care if you lived or died. This is the true story of the mountain men of 1831, not the romanticized version you see in movies, but the brutal, honest reality of what it took to survive in the American frontier. But before we dive into this tale of survival against impossible odds, I want to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're in and what time it is there right now. It's wild to think that some of you might be having morning coffee in London while I'm recording this late at night here in the States. The story I'm about to tell happened when the world was much bigger, when it took months to travel distances we cover in hours today. I've been telling this story for 40 years now, and still, people don't believe half of it. They sit in their comfortable chairs sipping their coffee and shake their heads when I describe what life was really like in the Rocky Mountains of 1831. But I was there. I lived it. And if you're willing to listen, really listen, I'll tell you about the 3 months that changed everything I thought I knew about survival, about men, and about what it takes to stay alive when the wilderness wants you dead. My name is James Morrison, though most folks called me Jimmy back then. I was 22 years old, fresh from St. Louis, and dumb as a box of rocks when it came to mountain living. I thought I was going to make my fortune trapping beaver. I thought it would be an adventure. Hell, I thought a lot of things that turned out to be dead wrong. But before we get to all that, let me paint you a picture of where this story begins. It's October 1831, high in the Rocky Mountains, and I'm waking up to what might be my last sunrise. The cold hits you first up there. Always does. It's not like the cold back home in Missouri. This is something alive, something with teeth that wants to crawl inside your bones and stay there. Let me tell you how I ended up in that godforsaken place to begin with, because it's important to understand just how unprepared I was for what awaited me. 3 months earlier, I'd been working as an apprentice blacksmith in St. Louis, hammering out horseshoes and barrel hoops, dreaming of something bigger than the smoky confines of Peterson's forge. Every day was the same. Wake before dawn, stoke the fires, shape hot metal until my arms ached, then collapse into bed with hands so raw they bled. But it was the stories that got to me. St. Louis in 1831 was the gateway to the West, and every tavern was full of tales about men making fortunes in the wilderness. Mountain men would come down from the high country once a year, their pockets heavy with gold from beaver pelts, regaling anyone who'd listen with stories of adventure and freedom. I remember the night I made my decision. I was sitting in Murphy's Tavern nursing a whiskey I couldn't afford when this weathered old coot named Jeremiah started talking about a friend of his who'd made $300 in a single season trapping beaver. $300? That was more than I'd see in 3 years at the forge. "Course," Jeremiah had said, taking a long pull from his jug. "Mountain life ain't for everyone. Takes a special kind of man to survive up there." That's all it took. One comment about being a special kind of man, and my pride was hooked like a fish on a line. I was 22, full of myself, and convinced I was exactly that special kind of man. The next morning I walked out of Peterson's forge for the last time, used my meagre savings to buy what I thought was proper mountain man gear, a rifle that looked impressive but shot crooked, boots that fell apart in the first week, and enough supplies to last maybe a month if I was careful. Peterson tried to talk me out of it, "Boy," he said, his face smudged with soot, "you don't know the first thing about wilderness living. You can barely start a fire without burning down the shop." He wasn't wrong. Looking back, I can't believe how naive I was. I thought wilderness survival was just camping with extra steps. I had no idea about reading weather, tracking animals, or the 1,000 small skills that meant the difference between life and death in the mountains. But I was young and stupid and convinced I knew better. I joined up with a supply train heading west, paying my passage by helping with the mules. It was my first taste of real hardship, sleeping on the ground, eating beans and hardtack, dealing with weather that changed from blazing sun to driving rain without warning. The other men on the train were experienced frontiersmen, and they took a certain grim pleasure in watching me struggle. "City boy's gonna be wolf food before the month's out," I heard one of them mutter, as I fumbled with my bedroll for the 10th time. Maybe they were right. I probably would have died in those first weeks if it wasn't for pure dumb luck and the fact that I was too stubborn to quit. When we reached the jumping-off point at the edge of civilization, most of the experienced men headed north toward established trapping grounds. I, in my infinite wisdom, decided to go it alone. That lasted exactly 4 days. I was following what I thought was a game trail, getting more lost by the hour, when I stumbled into Bill's camp. He was crouched by a small fire, cooking something that smelled better than anything I'd eaten in weeks. When he looked up and saw me standing there with my fancy gear and bewildered expression, he just shook his head. "Jesus Christ," he said, "another damn greenhorn." I tried to explain that I was an experienced woodsman, that I knew what I was doing, but Bill cut me off with a gesture. "Son," he said, "you're about as experienced as a newborn calf. Question is, you want to learn, or you want to die?" Pride wanted me to tell him I could handle myself just fine. Hunger and the growing realization that I was completely out of my depth made me swallow that pride. "I want to learn," I admitted. Bill studied me for a long moment, then gestured to a spot across the fire. "Sit. First lesson starts now." That was how I met old Bill. Not through some grand adventure or dramatic rescue, but by admitting I was a fool who needed help. It was the smartest thing I'd done since leaving St. Louis. Over the next few days, as we travelled deeper into the mountains, Bill began my education in staying alive. The first lesson was about my gear. He took one look at my rifle and snorted. This thing couldn't hit the broadside of a barn if you were standing inside it. He showed me how to sight it properly, how to load it in the dark, how to keep the powder dry in wet weather. My boots were next. "Fancy leather's fine for Sunday church," he said, examining the already deteriorating stitching. "Up here they'll fall apart in a week." He taught me to wrap my feet in strips of blanket, Indian style, until we could get proper moccasins. But the hardest lesson was learning to see the wilderness the way it really was. Not some romantic adventure playground, but a place that would kill you without malice or mercy if you made the wrong choice. Bill had a way of pointing out dangers I never would have noticed. The slight change in wind direction that meant weather was coming. The broken twigs that indicated a bear had passed through recently. The way water sounded different when it was running over rocks versus mud. "Most men die in the mountains," he told me one evening as we made camp, "because they think nature's got some kind of personal grudge against them. Truth is, nature don't care about you one way or the other. It's just doing what it does. Your job is to pay attention and stay out of the way." It was during those first weeks with Bill that I began to understand what I'd gotten myself into. This wasn't the romantic adventure I'd imagined. It was a constant test of endurance, skill, and judgment, with death as the penalty for failure. But it was also the most alive I'd ever felt. Every morning brought new challenges, new lessons, new ways to prove myself. I learned to read clouds and wind patterns, to identify edible plants and track animals through country that looked empty to my untrained eyes. Bill was a harsh teacher, quick to point out mistakes and slow to offer praise. But gradually I began to see the method behind his gruffness. "Kindness kills," he explained one day after he'd berated me for leaving food scraps around our camp. "Every mistake I let slide now is a mistake that'll get you killed when you're on your own." It was a hard lesson, but a necessary one. The wilderness didn't care about hurt feelings or wounded pride. It only cared whether you could survive its tests. By the time we'd been together a month, I was starting to feel like maybe I belonged in the mountains after all. I could set up a decent camp, start a fire in wet weather, and hit what I was aiming at with my rifle more often than not. Bill still called me a greenhorn, but there was less venom in it now. That's when we encountered our first real test. I remember opening my eyes to complete darkness, the kind that makes you wonder if you've gone blind overnight. My bedroll was stiff with frost despite being tucked under a measly shelter of pine boughs. Every muscle in my body screamed from the previous day's 20-mile trek through terrain that God never intended humans to cross. The ground beneath me felt like iron, so hard and cold that it seemed to suck the warmth right out of my bones. I could hear Bill breathing nearby, steady and controlled even in sleep. The man had an uncanny ability to wake at the slightest unusual sound, but he could sleep like the dead when nothing threatened us. I tried to shift position, looking for some comfort that didn't exist. My hip felt like someone had been using it for anvil practice, and my shoulder blade might as well have been resting on a bed of broken glass. This was my life now. Endless discomfort punctuated by moments of absolute terror. The reality of what I'd gotten myself into hit me fresh every morning. This wasn't the adventure I'd imagined back in St. Louis. There were no comfortable inns, no hot meals waiting at the end of the day, no soft beds or warm fires, just the constant grind of survival day after day, with the wilderness testing your resolve at every turn. I could smell snow in the air, that sharp metallic scent that meant winter was coming whether we were ready or not. October in the high country was unpredictable at best. You might wake to brilliant sunshine and warm temperatures, only to find yourself in a blizzard by afternoon. The mountains made their own weather, and they didn't consult human convenience when doing it. My stomach had become a constant presence, gnawing at me with a hunger that never fully went away. We'd been on short rations for days now, and the prospect of finding game in this barren landscape seemed increasingly unlikely. Bill kept saying the river valley would have beaver, but Bill said a lot of things and not all of them turned out to be true. I thought about the last real meal I'd eaten. A thick beef stew at Murphy's Tavern in St. Louis, with fresh bread and butter, washed down with cold beer. It seemed like something from another life, a dream of comfort and plenty that bore no resemblance to my current reality. The cold was creeping through my blankets now, finding every gap and seam with the persistence of water. I pulled the wool tighter around my shoulders, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with a fishing net. My feet had gone numb hours ago, and I couldn't feel my fingers despite keeping them buried in my armpits. "James, you still breathing over there?" The voice belonged to old Bill, my reluctant mentor in this hell of an existence. Bill was maybe 50, though the mountains aged a man faster than anything I'd ever seen. His face looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the peaks around us. "Unfortunately," I croaked back, my voice strange after days of barely speaking. "See, That's something people don't understand about mountain men. We didn't talk much. When you spend weeks without human contact, conversation becomes as foreign as a Sunday sermon. "Sun's coming soon," Bill grunted, already stirring despite the ungodly hour. "Need to check them traps before some damn wolverine beats us to it." I lay there for a moment, letting the reality of my situation crawl back into my consciousness like a cold fog. 3 months I'd been in these mountains. 3 months since I'd left St. Louis with dreams of fortune and adventure. What a damn fool I'd been. But I'd learned. Had to. The mountains killed the unprepared faster than you could say hypothermia, and I'd seen enough frozen corpses to know I never wanted to join their ranks. My stomach chose that moment to remind me it had been 2 days since our last proper meal. A stringy rabbit that Bill had snared, and we'd cooked over a fire no bigger than a teacup. We were saving our last piece of pemmican for a true emergency, and that was rule number 1 up there. Ration like your life depends on it, because it absolutely does. That's when Bill's voice cut through my thoughts like a knife. "You hear that?" I froze, suddenly alert, straining my ears against the pre-dawn silence. At first, nothing. Then, a twig snapping. Something moving through the trees around our camp. Something that was trying to be quiet but not quite managing it. The sound came again, closer this time. Whatever was out there was big enough to break branches underfoot, careful enough to move slowly, but not careful enough to move silently. In my limited experience, that combination usually meant trouble. My hand found the rifle beside my bedroll without conscious thought. The metal was so cold it burned my palm, but I forced myself to grip it anyway. Bill had taught me that a weapon you couldn't hold was worse than useless. It was dangerous to yourself and anyone depending on you. "Easy," Bill murmured so quietly I barely heard him. "Don't move sudden-like." The forest around us held that peculiar quality of silence that comes just before dawn, when even the nocturnal animals have settled down but the day creatures haven't yet stirred. It's a time when sound carries further and means more, when the snap of a twig can be the difference between life and death. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, the sound so loud in my ears I was sure whatever was out there could hear it too. Sweat began to form on my forehead despite the cold, and I had to resist the urge to wipe it away. Any movement might give away our position. The sounds were coming from multiple directions now. Not just one creature, but several, moving with coordination that spoke of intelligence rather than random animal behavior. Bill's breathing changed, becoming more controlled, more focused. I'd learned to read the subtle signs of his alertness over our weeks together. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow that didn't belong, too regular in its motion to be branches swaying in the wind. Then another, and another. We weren't dealing with animals at all. "Bear," I whispered, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs like it wanted out. Bill shook his head. His eyes narrowed into slits. "Too careful for bear." His voice carried a tension I'd rarely heard before, and that scared me more than anything else could have. The realization hit me like a physical blow. If it wasn't animals moving around our camp with such deliberate care, there was only one other possibility. In this country, in 1831, that possibility was often fatal. Then the wind shifted, bringing with it a new smell. Wood smoke mixed with something else, the unmistakable scent of other humans. In these mountains, that could mean only one thing. "Blackfeet," Bill whispered, so low I barely heard it. Now let me explain something about the Blackfeet in 1831. They weren't exactly throwing welcome parties for white trappers in their territory, more like the opposite. From their perspective, and they weren't wrong, we were thieves, stealing resources from their hunting grounds. They had every right to kill us and take our scalps, and they frequently did. The Blackfeet Confederacy controlled vast stretches of the northern Rockies, and they'd been fighting a running war with American trappers for the better part of a decade. They'd seen what happened to other tribes who welcomed white men: disease, displacement, broken treaties. The Blackfeet had decided early on that the best policy was to kill intruders before they could establish a foothold. I'd heard the stories, of course. Every trapper had tales of narrow escapes, of friends who disappeared without a trace, of camps found empty except for scattered gear and dark stains on the ground. Hugh Glass told of a party of 12 men wiped out to the last man, their bodies so mutilated they were barely recognizable as human. Bill had survived 3 encounters with Blackfeet war parties over the years. The first time he'd hidden in a beaver dam for 18 hours while warriors searched the area around him. The second time he'd convinced them he was crazy. Mountain men sometimes did that, acting completely insane in the hope that warriors would consider them touched by spirits and leave them alone. The third time, he'd fought his way out, killing 2 warriors before escaping into country so rough the war party couldn't follow. He still carried scars from the arrows that had found their mark during that running battle. Thing about the Blackfeet, he'd told me during one of our evening talks, is they're not savages like some folks claim. They're warriors, and damn good ones. They know this country better than we ever will. They can track a man through running water, and they don't make the mistakes that get other people killed. That was Bill's way. He respected his enemies, which was probably why he'd lived long enough to become an old man in a young man's profession. But respect didn't make them any less dangerous. If anything, it made them more so, because it meant you couldn't count on them to make the kind of errors that might give you an edge. They were professionals at warfare, just like Bill was a professional at survival. The stories I'd heard about Blackfeet fighting methods were enough to give a man nightmares. They were masters of psychological warfare, using terror as much as weapons to break their enemies. They could appear from nowhere, strike with devastating efficiency, and disappear back into the landscape like they'd never been there. And now it seemed they'd found us. I reached for my rifle, fingers curling around the cold metal, but Bill's hand stopped me. "Easy," he murmured. "No need to die today." Bill slowly reached for his possible bag. That's what we called the leather pouch that held all a man's personal items. From it he pulled something small wrapped in cloth. "Trade beads," he mouthed silently. The sky was lightening now, the faintest grey pushing back the darkness. Through the trees I caught glimpses of movement, not just 1 or 2 shapes, but many. My mouth went dry as sand. "When they come," Bill whispered, "you let me talk. You don't touch that rifle unless I say, understand?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. This was Tuesday for a mountain man, the constant knowledge that you're one wrong move away from death. Not from wild animals or weather, though those were always possibilities, but from other humans who saw you as either a threat or a walking supply depot. The first warrior stepped into our clearing like he owned it, which, come to think of it, he did. He was tall, his face painted red and black, carrying a trade musket that looked like it had seen plenty of use. Behind him came more, 7, 8, 9 of them, all armed, all watching us with the kind of attention a hawk gives a mouse. The lead warrior was an impressive figure, probably in his 30s, with the kind of presence that commanded attention. His war paint was applied with geometric precision, red ochre and charcoal mixed with bear grease, creating patterns that were both decorative and intimidating. Feathers hung from his hair, and his buckskin shirt was decorated with quill work that spoke of high status within his tribe. but it was his eyes that caught my attention. They were intelligent, calculating, missing nothing as they swept over our small camp. This wasn't some hot-headed young brave looking for glory. This was a seasoned warrior who'd survived long enough to lead war parties, which meant he was very good at what he did. The musket he carried was a trade gun, probably acquired in some previous encounter with white men. It was well maintained, the stock decorated with brass tacks, the barrel free of rust despite the harsh mountain environment. More importantly, he held it with the easy familiarity of a man who knew how to use it. His companions were equally impressive. These weren't random raiders, but a carefully selected war party, each man chosen for specific skills. I could see a tracker among them, his eyes constantly scanning the ground for sign. There was a young warrior who moved with the fluid grace of a natural athlete, and an older man whose scarred face and missing finger testified to years of combat experience. They were dressed for war, but also for weather. Buffalo robes and elk hide leggings, moccasins that would make no sound on forest floor, weapons that could kill silently if necessary. Everything about their appearance spoke of careful preparation and deadly competence. What struck me most was their discipline. They'd surrounded our camp without a sound, positioned themselves to control every avenue of escape, and waited for their leader's signal before revealing themselves. This wasn't random violence. It was military precision applied to wilderness warfare. The lead warrior's gaze settled on Bill, and I saw something like recognition pass between them. Not friendship. They were too far apart for that, but professional acknowledgement. One experienced fighter recognizing another. When he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, carrying the authority of command. The words were in Blackfoot, but the tone was clear enough. He was asking questions, not making threats. At least not yet. Bill sat up slowly, keeping his hands visible. His face showed nothing, not fear, not anger, just the flat neutrality that came from years of these encounters. "Speak any English?" Bill asked, his voice steady as bedrock. The lead warrior said nothing at first. His dark eyes moved from Bill to me, then to our small camp, assessing, calculating. I barely breathed, certain each heartbeat might be my last. "We got trade," Bill said, holding up the beads, then gesturing to our packs. Tobacco, too. The warrior spoke then, not to Bill, but to the others behind him. A rapid flow of words in a language I didn't understand, but the tone was clear enough. They were discussing whether we were worth the trouble of killing. What happened next taught me something important about frontier survival. The lead warrior stepped forward and pointed at our packs, then at the stream nearby. He spoke again, this time in broken English mixed with hand signs. "They want to know if we've seen beaver sign," Bill translated quietly, asking if we're trapping this valley. And just like that, I understood. They weren't here to kill us, at least not immediately. They were checking their hunting grounds, seeing if we were depleting resources they also depended on. It was business, not war. "Tell them we just got here," I whispered. "Tell them we're passing through." Bill nodded and spoke in what I later learned was broken. Blackfoot mixed with universal hand signs. He pointed west, made the motion of travelling, showed empty hands to indicate no traps set yet. The lead warrior considered this for what felt like an hour but was probably 30 seconds. Then he spoke again, and Bill's shoulders relaxed slightly. "They're moving on," Bill said quietly, "but they want the beads and some coffee." "That's it?" I asked, disbelieving. "That's it for now." The transaction was quick and businesslike. Bill handed over the beads and a small pouch of coffee grounds. The warriors took them without ceremony, and then, as quickly as they'd appeared, melted back into the forest like they'd never been there at all. I released a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. "I thought we were dead." Bill gave what might have been a laugh if you were feeling generous. "Days young," he said. "Still plenty of time for dying." That was my introduction to the mountain man's relationship with death. It wasn't some distant concept to be feared. It was a daily neighbour who might come knocking at any moment. The trick wasn't to avoid it entirely, but to make sure you saw it coming and were ready to negotiate. "Let's get moving," Bill said, already rolling up his bedding. "Need to be at the river by midday." And just like that, we were packing up. The sun was barely cresting the mountains, painting the snow-dusted peaks gold and pink. Any other time I might have called it beautiful. That morning it just meant I'd survived another night. As I followed Bill down the slope toward the river valley, my mind turned to what awaited us there. The whole reason I was in this God-forsaken wilderness to begin with. Beaver. Those flat-tailed, buck-toothed engineers of the waterways were worth their weight in gold back then. A single prime beaver pelt could fetch $4 to $6 in 1831, which was serious money for a young man with more ambition than sense. But the economics of the fur trade were more complex than I'd understood back in St. Louis. It wasn't just a matter of trapping beaver and selling pelts. There was a whole network of relationships, dependencies, and risks that determined who made money and who ended up dead in a mountain valley. First, there was the company system. The big fur companies, American Fur Company, Rocky Mountain Fur Company, Hudson's Bay Company, they controlled the trade. They provided supplies on credit to individual trappers, then bought the furs at prices they set. It sounded fair enough until you realized that everything you needed in the mountains cost 3 to 4 times what it cost in St. Louis. A pound of coffee that sold for 20 cents in town cost $1 in the mountains. Sugar was $2 a pound. Gunpowder, lead, traps, knives. Everything was marked up to prices that would make a highway robber blush. The companies justified it by pointing to the cost and risk of transportation, but the result was that most trappers ended up owing money at the end of each season. Then there was the quality issue. Not all beaver pelts were worth the same. Prime winter furs from adult animals could bring top dollar, but summer pelts were worth maybe half that. Young animals, damaged pelts, or furs taken at the wrong time of year might not even cover the cost of the traps used to catch them. Bill had explained the grading system to me during our long days of travel. Blanket beaver was the top grade. Large, thick pelts that would make the finest felt for hat making. Coat beaver was second grade. Good quality but smaller or slightly damaged. Parchment beaver was third grade. Thin, poor quality pelts that barely covered expenses. The skill lay not just in trapping the animals, but in knowing when and where to trap them for maximum value. Beaver fur went through seasonal changes, being thickest and richest just before winter set in. Trap too early, and you'd get summer pelts worth almost nothing. Trap too late, and you might find yourself caught in country that became impassable with snow. Location mattered too. Beaver in high mountain streams developed thicker, richer fur than those in lower valleys. But high country was also more dangerous, harder to reach, and impossible to work once winter arrived. It was a constant calculation of risk versus reward. Then there was the competition. Every valley that could support beaver was potentially claimed by someone. Other American trappers, British traders working south from Canada, Mexican traders coming up from the southwest, and of course the various Native American tribes who'd been trapping these waters for generations. Conflicts over trapping rights could turn deadly fast. I'd heard stories of trappers finding their trap lines cut, their camps raided, their caches stolen. Sometimes it was just professional rivalry taken too far. Other times it was calculated warfare designed to drive competitors out of lucrative territory. The Blackfeet we'd just encountered were part of that equation too. They weren't just defending their homeland, they were protecting a resource they'd been exploiting long before white men arrived. Beaver pelts were valuable to them too, tradable for guns, ammunition, metal goods, and other manufactured items they couldn't produce themselves. In a way, we were all in the same business. The difference was that they had the advantage of numbers, local knowledge, and the fact that this was their homeland. We had the advantage of direct connections to eastern markets and access to manufactured goods. It made for an uneasy balance that could tip toward violence without much provocation. "Stop wool gathering," Bill grunted over his shoulder. "Watch where you're stepping." I focused back on the trail, if you could call it that. It was really just a game path, barely visible, winding through pine and aspen. One wrong step on those slopes could mean a broken ankle, and a broken ankle out there was essentially a death sentence. "How much further to the river?" I asked, adjusting the heavy pack that seemed determined to pull me backwards down the mountain. Bill didn't turn around. "When we get there, we'll be there." Classic mountain man answer. These men didn't carry pocket watches or calendars. Time was measured in seasons, in daylight, in the distance you could travel before your legs gave out. They lived by rhythms modern people have forgotten. The rhythm of the sun, the rhythm of their own bodies, the rhythm of survival itself. 2 hours later, I was soaked with sweat despite the cold. The slope had grown steeper, the forest denser. My thighs burned with the effort of picking through deadfall and loose rock. Then I heard it, the distant rush of water. The sound grew louder as we descended, but it wasn't the gentle babbling I'd expected. This was something altogether more violent, a constant roar that spoke of serious water moving at serious speed. The kind of sound that made your chest vibrate and your ears ring even from a distance. The terrain was getting treacherous too. What had started as a reasonable game trail was becoming a maze of fallen timber, loose rock, and hidden holes that could snap an ankle or twist a knee. Bill moved through it with the sure-footed grace of long experience, but I found myself slipping and stumbling with increasing frequency. My pack seemed to get heavier with every step, the straps cutting into my shoulders despite the thick wool shirt I wore beneath them. Everything I owned was in that pack: spare clothes, ammunition, what little food we had left, the tools that might mean the difference between life and death in the coming weeks. I couldn't afford to lose it, but I was beginning to wonder if I could carry it much farther. The forest around us was changing too. The high-altitude pine and fir were giving way to aspen and cottonwood, trees that grew near water. I could smell the difference in the air, that green living scent that comes from flowing streams and wet earth. It was a welcome change from the thin, dry air of the high country, but there were signs of trouble too. Broken branches at bare height, scratch marks on tree bark, scat that looked fresh enough to steam in the cold air. This valley was home to more than just beaver, and not all of the residents would be happy to see us. Bill paused, head cocked like a hunting dog. "River's up," he said. "Spring melt's still coming down from the eye country." I could hear it now, too. The particular sound water makes when there's a lot of it moving fast. Not the musical tinkling of a mountain stream, but the bass rumble of serious current. The kind of water that could sweep a man away and carry him miles downstream before bothering to drown him. "Is that bad?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Bill's expression told me everything I needed to know. Makes everything harder. setting traps, checking lines, processing pelts. High water means angry water, and angry water kills. He was right, of course. Fast water was cold water, and cold water in October meant hypothermia waiting for anyone unlucky enough to fall in. Even if you didn't drown, even if you made it to shore, wet clothes in mountain weather could kill you almost as fast as drowning. But we'd come too far to turn back now. Our supplies were running low, winter was coming whether we were ready or not, and this valley represented our best chance of making the kind of profit that would justify the risks we'd already taken. Another hour of hard hiking brought us to a clearing, and there it was, the river. Not some gentle babbling brook from a children's story, but a churning, frothing monster cutting through the valley like liquid dynamite. The sound was deafening, the spray visible even from where we stood. The river was everything Bill had feared and more. Snowmelt from the high peaks had turned what was probably a reasonable stream into something that belonged in the ocean. White water crashed over boulders the size of houses, throwing spray 20 feet into the air. The banks were scoured clean, marked with debris lines that showed where even higher water had run in recent days, but there were encouraging signs too. Beaver sign was everywhere, chewed stumps, drag marks leading to the water, the telltale pointed stumps that showed where these industrious rodents had been at work. If we could figure out how to trap in this torrent, we might find ourselves in some of the richest beaver country either of us had ever seen. Now we get to work, Bill said, dropping his pack with obvious relief. This is where the real business of being a mountain man began. Not the romanticized horseback riding through stunning vistas that artists like to paint, but the brutal, exhausting, often disgusting work of harvesting beaver. The reality of trapping was nothing like what I'd imagined back in St. Louis. There, sitting in Murphy's Tavern listening to stories, it had all sounded so straightforward. Find beaver, trap beaver, sell pelts, get rich. The actual process was infinitely more complex, requiring knowledge that took years to master, and skills that could mean the difference between a profitable season and starvation. Bill had been studying this stretch of river for the better part of an hour, reading signs that were invisible to my untrained eyes. He'd examined chewed stumps, looking for tooth marks that would tell him the size and age of the animals that had made them. He'd studied drag marks in the mud, following them with his eyes to determine where the beaver were entering and leaving the water. Beaver are creatures of habit, he explained as he worked. They follow the same routes day after day, season after season. Your job is to figure out what those routes are and put your traps right where they can't avoid them. It sounded simple enough, but I was beginning to understand that everything about mountain life was deceptively complex. What looked like random animal behavior to me was actually a sophisticated pattern that revealed itself only to those who knew how to read it. See that? Bill pointed to what looked like an ordinary patch of mud near the water's edge. That's a beaver slide. They use it to get from their lodge to feeding areas. See how it's worn smooth? That tells you this is an active route used regular like. I looked harder and finally saw what he was talking about. The mud was indeed worn smooth, polished by the passage of wet beaver bodies. There were even tiny claw marks visible if you knew where to look, evidence of animals struggling for purchase on the slippery surface. And over there, Bill continued, pointing to a fallen log that extended partway into the water, that's a beaver highway. They'll swim along it because it gives them cover from above. Predators can't see them as easy. The more Bill explained, the more I realized how much I didn't know. Beaver weren't just random animals splashing around in the water. They were sophisticated engineers with complex social structures, territorial behaviors and seasonal patterns that governed every aspect of their lives. Different times of year they do different things, Bill said. Spring, they're repairing winter damage to their dams and lodges. Summer, they're gathering food and building up fat reserves. Fall, they're preparing for winter, cutting trees and storing food underwater where it won't freeze. Winter, they're mostly inactive, living off their stored food and staying in their lodges. Each season required different trapping strategies, different approaches to reading sign, different understanding of where and when beaver would be vulnerable. A trap set in the right place at the wrong time would catch nothing. A trap set at the right time in the wrong place would be equally useless. Weather matters too, Bill continued. Beaver are more active just before storms, less active during them. They're more active at dawn and dusk than midday. They're more likely to investigate new scents when the temperature's dropping than when it's rising. The variables were endless, and each one could affect whether a trap succeeded or failed. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces kept changing shape, where success depended not just on knowledge, but on intuition developed through years of observation and experience. First thing, Bill said, opening his pack with practiced efficiency, we need to make bait. He pulled out a small dark object wrapped in oilcloth and unwrapped it carefully. The smell hit me before I saw what it was. Sharp, musky, like nothing I'd ever encountered. Castor gland, Bill explained, holding up what looked like a shriveled dark brown lump about the size of a man's thumb. From the last beaver I took back in April. I won't get into the anatomical specifics of what exactly a castor gland is, but I can tell you this. It stank to high heaven, and beavers could smell it from remarkable distances. Bill took out a small pot and began preparing the bait with the care of a pharmacist mixing medicine. He added the gland, then pulled small pouches from his possible bag. Cinnamon, he explained, adding a pinch of brown powder. Clove, nutmeg. He pulled out a flask and poured a splash of amber liquid into the mixture. And whiskey. The resulting paste looked like something you'd scrape off your boot after walking through a barnyard. But to a beaver, apparently, it was irresistible. Why does that work? I asked, trying not to gag. Bill shrugged. Smells like another beaver. Males think it's competition. Females think it's a mate. Either way, they come looking. That was the brilliant simplicity of frontier knowledge. No scientific papers, no controlled experiments, just generations of trial and error passed down by those who lived long enough to pass it down. Now for the traps, Bill said, moving to the river's edge. The traps themselves were brutal in their efficiency. Made of forged iron weighing around 5 pounds each, with powerful spring mechanisms and steel jaws designed to catch a beaver by the leg and hold it until the trapper returned. Usually those beaver drowned before we got back. Normally we'd set these underwater, Bill explained, wading into the shallows that made my teeth ache just watching. Beaver swims up, triggered by the bait, steps on their pan and, he demonstrated, setting the trigger mechanism with practiced ease. Snap. But with the river running high and fast, Bill had to adapt. Instead of submerging the trap, he found a small channel where beavers might travel between their lodge and feeding areas. He carefully positioned the trap there, covering it with leaves and mud until it was nearly invisible. We secure it with a stake, he continued, hammering a length of sharpened wood into the ground and attaching a chain from the trap. Otherwise, beaver drags it into deep water and we never see it again. I helped Bill set 4 more traps along the river, learning the technique as we went. It was precise work, requiring attention to detail and knowledge of beaver behavior that took years to develop. Every trap had to be positioned just right, concealed perfectly, baited properly. The process was far more involved than I'd anticipated. Each trap location required careful analysis of water depth, current speed, bottom composition, and beaver travel patterns. Set a trap in water too deep, and the beaver might swim over it. Too shallow, and the trap might be visible or ineffective. Too much current, and the scent would wash away too quickly. Too little, and the scent wouldn't disperse properly. Bill taught me to read the water like a book. See how the current swirls around that rock, he said, pointing to a boulder that created eddies and backwaters. That's where debris collects, where a beaver might stop to investigate, but it's also where your trap chain might get tangled in underwater brush. Every decision involved trade-offs, calculations of risk versus reward that required both knowledge and judgment. The placement of a single trap could be the product of dozens of observations and considerations, each one critical to success. The physical work was demanding too. Wading in mountain water that was barely above freezing, feeling around underwater for the right spots to set traps, hammering stakes into rocky stream bottoms while trying not to make noise that might spook the animals. It was exhausting, uncomfortable work that left your hands numb and your feet aching. But there was also something deeply satisfying about mastering these skills, about learning to think like the animals you were pursuing, about understanding the intricate relationships between water and land, predator and prey, season and behavior that governed life in the wilderness. Trapping's not about being smarter than the beaver, Bill explained as we worked. It's about understanding them well enough to predict what they'll do, then being there when they do it. The psychological aspect was as important as the physical. You had to think like an engineer to understand how beaver modified their environment, like a hunter to predict their movements, like a weather forecaster to anticipate how conditions would affect their behavior. "Weather coming," Bill said, studying the sky as we finished the last trap. "Storm'll be here by tonight. Beaver get restless before storms. Might work in our favor." I was learning to read those same signs, the way clouds built up against distant peaks, the subtle shift in wind direction, the way the air pressure seemed to change even though I couldn't explain how I knew. These weren't mystical abilities. They were practical skills developed through constant observation and experience. The mountain men who survived learned to read everything: weather patterns, animal behavior, seasonal changes, human sign, the subtle indicators that meant the difference between safety and danger, success and failure, life and death. "We'll check these at dawn tomorrow," Bill said as we finished the last one. "Now we need shelter." The sky had clouded over during our work, the temperature dropping noticeably. In the mountains, weather changes faster than a politician's promises, and this looked like snow. "Looks like we're in for it," I observed, eyeing the grey mass of clouds building overhead. Bill nodded grimly. "Before nightfall, need to get a proper shelter up. Not like the basic bedrolls under pine boughs from the night before. With snow coming, exposure would kill us faster than any Blackfeet war party." "What kind of shelter?" I asked. "Wiki up," Bill answered. "Simple, effective." I spent the next 2 hours learning to build a wiki up, which was basically a small dome-shaped structure made with a framework of poles covered with brush, bark, or hides. Bill directed the construction with few words, showing rather than telling how to bend and secure saplings to create a dome about 5 feet high and 8 feet across. "Big enough for 2 men and a small fire," he said, stepping back to assess our work. We covered the frame with pine boughs, starting from the bottom and working up, creating overlapping rows like shingles to shed water, or in this case, snow. By the time we finished, fat white flakes were already beginning to fall. The forest around us grew quiet, sound dampened by the snowfall. The river continued its relentless rush, but everything else seemed to hold its breath, waiting. "Get firewood," Bill ordered, "dry as you can find, fallen logs inside hollow trees." I scavenged while Bill created a small fire pit inside the wickiup, carefully clearing a space and surrounding it with river rocks to contain the flames. As darkness fell, I crawled into the shelter with an armload of the driest wood I could find. Bill had a small fire already catching, the smoke rising to a hole he'd left at the top of the structure. "Not too big," he warned, "just enough for warmth. Too much smoke inside will blind us." The small space warmed quickly, though the smoke did sting my eyes despite Bill's careful fire management. I sat with my back against the curved wall, watching the snow fall through the smoke hole above, and tried to process what my life had become. "Will the traps still work in the snow?" I asked. Bill nodded, chewing on a piece of jerky that looked like it had been carved from shoe leather. "Beaver don't care about snow. They keep working, so do we." He handed me a piece of the jerky. It was hard as wood and tasted of salt and smoke. You had to suck on it for several minutes before it was soft enough to chew, but it was food, and out there, that was all that mattered. "Tomorrow," Bill said between bites, "we check traps at first light, then move downstream, set more." "How many beaver do we need?" I asked, "for it to be worth all this?" Bill considered the question like he was calculating the national debt. 40 prime pelts would make for a good season. That's about all we can carry anyway. 40 beaver pelts at roughly $5 each. $200, equivalent to over $6,000 today. Not bad for a few months' work, assuming you survived to collect it. "What about the Blackfeet?" I asked. The morning's encounter was still fresh in my mind, like a splinter you can't quite dig out. Bill shrugged. "We keep watch. We move quick. We don't stay in one place too long." The snow fell heavier now, visible through the smoke hole as swirling white against black. Inside our rough shelter, the small fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. Despite the discomfort, the smoke, the hard ground, the persistent cold touching any body part not directly facing the flames, there was a primitive satisfaction to the moment. I'd made it through another day in a place that didn't care if I lived or died. That was something. "Bill," I said after a long silence, "how long have you been doing this?" The older man stared into the small fire for so long I thought he hadn't heard me. When he finally answered, his voice was quiet, almost thoughtful. 15 winters. Started when St. Louis was barely more than a trading post. "What keeps you coming back?" I gestured at the wilderness beyond our shelter walls. Again that long pause. When Bill spoke, his words stayed with me for years afterward. "Out here, a man knows exactly where he stands. Nature don't lie to you, don't cheat you, try to kill you, sure, but it's honest about it." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Cities are full of smiling men who'd slit your throat for $1. At least out here you see the knife coming." The mountain men weren't just skilled survivors, I realized. They were people choosing brutal freedom over what they saw as dishonest civilization. They'd rather face an honest death in the wilderness than a lying life in town. The fire popped, sending a spark onto my leg. I brushed it away, feeling the cold creep back in as the flames dwindled. "Get some sleep," Bill said. "Dawn comes early and the beaver won't wait." I settled onto my bedroll, using my pack as a pillow. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the trees like something lost and looking for home. Snow pattered gently on the pine boughs covering our shelter. Despite the hard ground beneath me, exhaustion pulled at my limbs like lead weights. The last thing I saw before closing my eyes was Bill still sitting up, knife in one hand, staring at the smoke hole above as if expecting something to come through it at any moment. And I realized he probably was, because in the wilderness of 1831, survival wasn't just a skill, it was everything. Morning came with the kind of cold that makes your bones ache before you're even fully awake. I came to consciousness slowly, like swimming up from the bottom of a deep, dark pool. Bill was already stirring the fire back to life, the small flames casting just enough light to see his frost-bearded face in the pre-dawn darkness. Outside, snow had transformed our world completely, 6 inches at least, turning the forest into something alien and silent, beautiful and deadly all at once. "Trapline," Bill grunted, handing me a piece of jerky for breakfast. "Eat while we move." My body protested as I rolled up from the ground. Everything hurt. My back from sleeping on stone, my hands from yesterday's work, my feet from miles of mountain hiking in boots that still hadn't broken in properly. This was what they didn't put in the adventure books. The constant grinding discomfort of frontier life. "What if the traps are buried in snow?" I asked, voice rough from smoke and sleep. Bill gave me a look that clearly said he thought I was an idiot. "We find them. Of course. Mountain men didn't have the luxury of weather delays. Either you adapted or you died, and dying was generally considered poor form." I crawled out of the wiki-up into a world transformed. The snow caught the first grey light of dawn, soft blue shadows stretching across untouched white. It would have been beautiful if I weren't about to wade through it in soaked pants and frozen boots. "Stay in my tracks," Bill ordered, stepping out first to break trail through the fresh powder. I followed gratefully. The slightly easier path he created still exhausting work. The snow was deeper than it looked, coming halfway up my shins with each step. Within minutes, my feet were numb and my pants were soaked to the knee. "Remind me why we can't just wait for the snow to melt," I muttered through chattering teeth. Bill didn't even turn around. "'Cause we'll starve before spring, boy." Fair point. The river looked different in morning light, still dangerous, but the snow along its banks softened its appearance, made it seem almost peaceful. Bill led me to the first trap with memory guiding him more than any visible markers. "Here," he said, stopping at what looked like just another patch of snow-covered ground. He knelt and brushed away the white powder, revealing the chain leading to the trap. When he gave it a tug, there was resistance. "Got something," he said, a rare hint of satisfaction in his voice. He pulled steadily on the chain, drawing up the trap from beneath a layer of wet leaves and mud. And there it was, a large beaver, leg caught in the steel jaws, very much dead. "Drowned itself," Bill observed, examining the animal. "Pulled the trap into deeper water despite the stake." The beaver was bigger than I'd expected, maybe 30 pounds, with rich dark fur and that iconic flat tail. Its small front paws looked almost human-like, tiny hands that made this harder to look at than I'd anticipated. "Don't go soft," Bill warned, catching my expression. "Ain't a pet." "I know," I said quickly, "just bigger than I thought." Bill nodded approvingly. "Good size, prime pelt." He reached for his knife, not the small one he kept in his belt, but a larger one from his pack. "Now you learn the next part." The next part, it turned out, was skinning the beaver. Bill worked with practiced efficiency, making an initial cut around the animal's hind legs, then essentially pulling the hide off like a wet sock, turning it inside out as he went. "Keep the fur side in," he instructed as I watched, fascinated and slightly sick. "Keeps it clean, makes it easier to flesh later." The smell was something I'll never forget. A mix of wet animal, river mud, and something musky that must have been uniquely beaver. Not pleasant, but I was learning that pleasant smells were a luxury of civilization. "What about the meat?" I asked as Bill finished removing his pelt. "Edible," Bill said. already starting to butcher the carcass. Some parts better than others. We'll take the tail and the back legs. Rest goes back to the forest. Wait, people actually ate beaver tail? Bill caught my expression, and something that might have been a smile crossed his weathered face. Mostly fat, he explained. Good eating in winter. Later research would tell me that beaver tail was considered a delicacy among mountain men and native tribes. It was almost entirely fat, which made it incredibly valuable in an environment where calories meant survival. With the beaver processed, Bill reset the trap and we moved on to the next location. I followed, now carrying one wet beaver pelt and a few pounds of meat wrapped in oilcloth, feeling like I was finally starting to understand what this life was really about. The second trap was empty, though clearly disturbed. Something set it off, Bill muttered, examining the mechanism. Could have been anything. Branch in the current, muskrat, even a big fish. He reset it carefully, using more of the castor bait to refresh the scent. The third trap held another beaver, smaller than the first but still a good size. This one was alive. Step back, Bill warned as we approached. The beaver thrashed when it saw us, teeth bared, trying to drag itself toward the water. Those teeth were something to see. Nature's chisels, capable of felling a 12-inch diameter tree in under an hour. I didn't want to imagine what they could do to a man's leg. Bill approached the animal from behind and with a single precise blow of a short club he kept in his belt dispatched it quickly. The efficiency was almost merciful, no prolonged suffering. "Now you do the skinning," he said, stepping back. I hesitated, knife in hand. "I don't want to mess up the pelt." "You will," Bill said flatly. "Only way to learn is to ruin a few. Better to ruin this small one than a prime pelt later." So I knelt in the snow and tried to mimic what I'd seen Bill do. My cuts were hesitant, my hands clumsy in the cold. The hide didn't separate as easily as it had when Bill did it. "You're cutting too deep," he corrected. "Just through the skin, not into the meat." It was disturbingly intimate work, this separation of skin from flesh. By the time I finished, my hands were bloody to the wrists, and the pelt was, well, not as neat as Bill's, but intact. "It'll do," Bill said, which from him was practically a standing ovation. The fourth and fifth traps were empty, though Bill seemed unsurprised. 1 in 3 is good odds, he explained as we hiked back to camp. 2 in 5 is excellent. Back at the wiki-up, Bill showed me the next step in processing the pelts, fleshing. He spread the first pelt on a smooth log positioned near the fire, hide inside out with the fur protected and the skin side facing up, still dotted with bits of fat and membrane. He took a specialized tool from his pack, a dull curved blade attached to a handle. "Fleshing knife," he explained. "Too sharp and you'll cut through the hide." I watched as he scraped the skin side methodically, removing every last bit of fat and tissue. "Clean hide takes the tanning better," he explained. "Any flesh left will rot, ruin the pelt." After demonstrating on the first beaver, he handed me the tool. "Your turn." My attempts were slow and clumsy, too cautious at first, then too aggressive. Bill adjusted my technique with gruff instructions that somehow managed to be both criticism and encouragement. By the time I finished the second pelt, my arms ached, but the hide was clean. "Now we stretch them," Bill said, producing several metal hoops from his pack, circular frames about 2 feet in diameter. "In the old days, we'd make these from willow branches," he explained. "These travel better." The wet pelts were stretched over the hoops, the edges secured with small wooden pins pushed through the skin into the frame. When finished, they looked like furry tambourines. "They'll dry by tomorrow," Bill said. "Then we pack them and move on." "That's it?" I asked. Bill shook his head. "That's just the start. At Rendezvous, we'll sell these to the company men. They'll send them east where they'll be properly tanned and made into hats. The famous beaver hats. The entire reason for our presence in this wilderness. Fashion that drove men to the edges of the known world, risking death daily for something as frivolous as a hat that would be out of style in 5 years. What about the meat? I asked, nodding toward the beaver parts we'd brought back. Stew, Bill said. But first we need to do something about those clothes of yours. I looked down at my pants, soaked from the snow and now starting to freeze as the temperature dropped again. My once fine St. Louis garments were never meant for this life. What's wrong with my clothes? Bill snorted. Cotton kills, boy. Gets wet, stays wet, you freeze to death. Need something that works in this country. Like what? Buckskin, Bill said simply. From his pack he pulled a rolled deer hide. Not a raw pelt like the beaver, but something that had clearly been through some kind of tanning process. Shot a small buck 3 days before I found you, he explained. Been working this hide at night while you sleep. You haven't been sleeping? Bill shrugged. Sleep when necessary. This was more important. Can't have you dying from wet clothes. There was a weird kind of care in his gruffness, like a father who shows love through action rather than words. He might not like me much, but he was invested in keeping me alive. Bill spread the hide on the ground outside the wickiup. The snow had stopped, though the air remained frigid enough to hurt your lungs. First step in making buckskin is getting a fresh hide, he explained. Then you do the same as with the beaver. Flesh it, get all the meat and fat off. The hide he showed me was clean, the hair already removed, leaving just the skin. Had to scrape the hair off, he explained. Different from beaver, we want the fur on those, but for buckskin, we want just the leather. Now comes the important part, Bill said, picking up a small wooden bowl that had been sitting by the fire. Inside was a greyish mass that looked like... Oh God, is that... I started, already knowing the answer. Brains, Bill confirmed, from the deer. Every animal has just enough brains to tan its own hide. That wasn't just mountain man wisdom, it was actually true for most animals. A deer's brain contained enough oils and lecithin to adequately tan its own hide. Nature's perfect recycling system. I watched, fascinated and slightly nauseated as Bill mixed the brains with warm water into a paste. He worked this mixture deep into the hide, covering every inch of the surface. Brain oils break down the fibres, he explained as he worked. Makes the hide soft, supple. Otherwise it dries hard as a board. The smell was distinctive. Not as bad as I'd feared, but definitely not something you'd want as cologne. This stays on overnight, Bill said, rolling up the hide with the brain mixture inside. Tomorrow we'll wash it and start working it. That night I slept better despite the cold and hard ground. Exhaustion was winning out over discomfort. I dreamed of beaver teeth and men wearing hides, of rivers running with gold coins instead of water. I woke to Bill's voice cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Up, got work to do. The morning was clear, the sun rising in a cloudless sky that promised at least temporary better weather. After a breakfast of beaver tail, which was actually surprisingly good, rich and fatty like bone marrow, Bill retrieved the deer hide. Now we wash out the brains, he said, taking the hide to the river's edge. We rinsed the hide thoroughly in water so cold it made my hands ache. The brain mixture washed away, leaving the hide lighter in colour and somehow more pliable. Next part is the real work, Bill said, bringing the wet hide back to camp. For the next 2 hours I watched and then helped, as Bill demonstrated the process of softening the hide. This involved stretching, pulling, and working every inch of the material as it dried. Keep it moving, Bill instructed. If it dries stiff, all that brain work was for nothing. We took turns pulling the hide over a smooth log, using our body weight to create tension. then working it with our hands, massaging the fibers. It was exhausting physical labor that made my shoulders burn and fingers cramp. In the old days, Bill said between pulls, native women would chew the hide to soften it. Chew it, I repeated, horrified. Bill nodded. Hours of chewing every inch makes for the softest buckskin. I looked down at the hide in my hands with newfound appreciation. Think I'll stick with this method. By midday, the hide had transformed from stiff raw material to something soft and flexible, almost like cloth but stronger. The colour had changed too to a soft yellowish tan. Not done yet, Bill said, just as I thought the work might be finished. Most important step left. Which is? Smoking, Bill said. Raw tanned hide gets wet, it stiffens right back up. Smoking fixes that. Bill constructed a small specialised fire pit a short distance from our wiki-up. It was essentially a hole in the ground with a mound built up around it. Needs smoke, not flame, he explained, filling the pit with rotten wood and damp, punky logs he'd collected from the forest floor. With the smoke-producing fire ready, Bill sewed the buckskin into a rough bag shape using sinew, thin, strong fibres from animal tendons that served as thread. He left one end open. Now we let the smoke do its work, he said, setting up a tripod of sticks over the fire pit. He hung the buckskin bag from this frame, open end down so the smoke would fill it completely. How long? I asked, watching the thick white smoke billowing up into the buckskin. Few hours, Bill said. When it's the colour of old leather and smells like a smokehouse, it's done. While we waited, Bill showed me how to prepare the beaver tail for cooking. He held it over the fire until the scaly outer skin blistered and could be peeled off, revealing the fatty tissue inside. Rich eating, he said, cutting off a piece and handing it to me. It was like nothing I'd ever tasted. Pure fat, essentially, but somehow satisfying in a way that went beyond flavour. My body craved the calories, and this delivered them in abundance. We need to talk about what comes next, Bill said as we ate. What do you mean? Winter's coming fast. We got maybe 6 weeks before the high passes close. After that, we're stuck here until spring. The implications of that hit me like a physical blow. 6 months trapped in the mountains with whatever supplies we could gather in the next few weeks. What do we need? I asked. More meat, more pelts to trade for supplies, and a better shelter than that wiki-up. What kind of shelter? Cabin, Bill said simply. Small, but solid. Somewhere we can weather the worst storms. The next 3 weeks became a blur of constant activity. We moved our trapline daily, working our way down the valley system, taking beaver where we found them, and moving on before we depleted any one area too severely. This nomadic existence was the reality of mountain man life. Constant movement, constant adaptation to changing conditions and opportunities. We'd establish a temporary camp, work the local beaver population for a few days or a week, then pack up and move to the next promising location. Each new campsite required the same careful evaluation that we'd applied to trap placement. We needed access to water, but not so close that flooding was a risk. We needed shelter from prevailing winds, but with escape routes if we were discovered by hostile forces. We needed firewood, but in areas where smoke wouldn't be visible from long distances. The daily routine became as precise as military drill. Rise before dawn, check the trap line, process any beaver we'd caught, reset disturbed traps, scout for new locations, make camp, prepare for the next day. Each task had to be performed efficiently and quietly with constant awareness of our surroundings. Bill was teaching me more than trapping techniques during these weeks. He was showing me how to live in the wilderness as a profession, how to think like a predator while remaining human, how to balance the demands of survival with the requirements of business. Successful trapper, he said one evening as we worked on pelts by firelight. isn't just someone who can catch beaver, he's someone who can catch them efficiently, process them properly, transport them safely, and get them to market in condition to bring top prices. The business aspects were as complex as the trapping itself. Every decision, which areas to work, how long to stay in one location, when to move to new territory, had to balance immediate needs against long-term strategy. Work an area too hard, Bill explained, and you'll wipe out the local population. Might get more pelts this season, but you'll have nothing to come back to next year. Work it too light, and someone else will move in and take what you left behind. Resource management was a constant concern, not just of our own supplies, but of the beaver populations we depended on for our livelihood. The most successful trappers understood that they were managing a renewable resource that required careful stewardship to remain productive. The competition was real too. We encountered sign of other trappers regularly, old campsites, cut trap lines, areas that had obviously been worked recently. Sometimes we found actual competitors, other partnerships or individual trappers working the same general territory. These encounters were always tense. Territorial disputes could turn violent quickly, especially when men had invested weeks of dangerous travel to reach productive trapping grounds. But there was also professional courtesy among experienced trappers, and understanding that the mountains were big enough for everyone if people were reasonable. Bill had a reputation for being fair in his dealings with other trappers, and that reputation served us well. When we encountered a pair of French-Canadian voyageurs working the upper reaches of our valley, instead of conflict we found cooperation. Bonjour, mon ami, called the elder of the two, a weathered man named Baptiste who'd been trapping since before I was born. Comment allez-vous? Bill's French was rudimentary but adequate for basic communication. More importantly, he understood the protocols of wilderness courtesy that governed these meetings. They shared information about tribal movements, weather patterns, and beaver populations in areas they'd already worked. In return, Bill told them about the route we'd taken to reach this valley and the conditions we'd encountered along the way. Blackfeet moving south, Baptiste warned. War party, maybe 20 warriors. We saw their sign 3 days' ride north of here. This was exactly the kind of intelligence that could save lives. The Wilderness Telegraph, informal information sharing among trappers, traders, and friendly Indians, was often the only warning system available in country where tribal conflicts could erupt without notice. My skills improved rapidly under Bill's relentless tutelage. I learned to read water like text, spotting the subtle signs that indicated beaver activity. I learned to set traps by feel in the dark, to skin a beaver in minutes, to flesh a hide without damaging it. But more than that, I learned to think like a mountain man, to calculate risk constantly, to read weather patterns, to move through the forest without leaving sign, to live on little and make do with less. We encountered the Blackfeet twice more, each time managing to trade our way out of trouble. Once we stumbled across a grizzly bear feeding on a moose carcass. That time we backed away very slowly and found another route to our traps. By the end of October we had 37 prime beaver pelts and the makings of a decent winter's survival. We'd also found the perfect spot for our winter shelter, a small clearing protected by a rock overhang, near water but defensible if necessary. Building the cabin was back-breaking work. We used deadfall when possible, cutting only what we had to with our small axes. The structure was simple, one room maybe 12 feet by 16, with a stone fireplace and chimney that took us 3 days to build properly. Chinked with mud and moss, Bill explained as we worked to seal the gaps between logs. Keeps out most of the wind. The roof was the hardest part. layers of pine bark and sod that would shed water and snow but still allow some ventilation. When we finished, it looked like something a child might build with Lincoln logs, but it was solid, weatherproof, and most importantly, warm. Our first winter storm arrived the day after we moved in. I woke to a silence so complete it was almost frightening. No wind, no water sounds, nothing. Just the kind of absolute quiet that comes with heavy snowfall. "Look outside," Bill said from his place by the fire. I opened the door to a wall of white. 3 feet of snow had fallen overnight, transforming our little clearing into something from a fairy tale. Beautiful and deadly. "Good thing we finished when we did," I said, closing the door quickly against the cold. Bill nodded. Now we wait. Waiting, it turned out, was its own kind of survival challenge. Not the acute danger of exposure or starvation, but the grinding challenge of boredom, of being trapped in a small space with another person for months on end. The psychological pressure of winter isolation was something no one had prepared me for back in St. Louis. You think you know what alone means until you've spent weeks in a cabin with only one other person for company, watching the snow pile higher outside your window, knowing that help is hundreds of miles away and won't be coming until spring. The first few weeks weren't too bad. There was still work to do, organizing supplies, repairing gear, planning for spring. Bill was a fountain of wilderness knowledge, and I spent hours learning skills I should have mastered before leaving civilization. He taught me to make fishhooks from bone, to braid rope from sinew, to carve bowls and spoons from wood. But as November turned to December, and December dragged toward January, the weight of isolation began to settle on us like the snow outside. Conversations became shorter, periods of silence longer. We developed routines that became almost ritualistic in their precision. Who tended the fire when, who cooked what meals, who ventured outside to check the weather or gather firewood. Bill dealt with it by working constantly, maintaining equipment, making new gear, planning for spring. His hands were never idle. When he wasn't carving or sewing or sharpening tools, he was checking our supplies, calculating how long they'd last, rationing out portions for the days ahead. I tried to follow his example, learning to make moccasins from scraps of hide, to braid rope from sinew, to carve useful items from wood. But my hands weren't as skilled as his, my patience not as developed. I found myself staring at the walls, counting the days since we'd seen another human being, wondering if this was what it felt like to go slowly insane. The cabin itself became both salvation and prison. It was maybe 12 feet by 16, large enough for 2 men to avoid stepping on each other, small enough that privacy was impossible. Every sound was amplified, every habit magnified to the point of irritation. Bill's morning routine of checking his rifle became a ritual that woke me at the same time every day. My tendency to crack my knuckles became a source of visible annoyance to him. The walls were chinked with mud and moss, but still the wind found ways in. Drafts crept along the floor, stirred the ashes in the fireplace, made the flame of our single candle dance and flicker. On the worst nights, frost formed on the inside walls despite the fire, and our breath hung in visible clouds even under our roof. We had one window, a small opening covered with oiled paper that let in a dim, yellowish light during the short winter days. Through it, we could watch the snow accumulate, sometimes falling so heavily that we couldn't see the trees 20 feet away. The world outside became an abstract white void, beautiful and terrifying in its emptiness. Food became an obsession. Not because we were starving. Bill had laid in adequate supplies and we supplemented them with trapped rabbits and ptarmigan when possible. but because eating was one of the few pleasures left to us. We planned meals days in advance, discussing the merits of different combinations of preserved meat and dried vegetables, with the intensity that city folks reserve for politics or religion. Bill had cached supplies in several locations around the valley, buried in pits lined with bark and stones to keep them from freezing or spoiling. Every few weeks, when the weather permitted, we'd dig up one of these caches, and the variety it provided felt like a gift from heaven. A handful of dried apples, a piece of salt pork, coffee beans that hadn't been ground to powder. These small luxuries took on importance far beyond their actual value. The cold was a constant presence, something you learn to live with rather than overcome. On the worst days, the temperature dropped so low that our breath froze instantly, forming ice crystals that tinkled to the floor. Metal became dangerous to touch with bare skin. Water left in a cup overnight froze solid despite being near the fire, but there were compensations too. The silence of a winter forest is unlike anything else on Earth. Snow muffles sound, creating a hush so profound that your own heartbeat seems loud. On clear nights, the stars were so bright they cast shadows, and the northern lights painted the sky in sheets of green and blue that took your breath away. And slowly, gradually, I began to understand something that Bill had known all along. This wasn't just an endurance test, it was a transformation. The city boy who'd left St. Louis full of romantic notions about mountain life was being stripped away, layer by layer, until what remained was something harder, more essential. Someone who could survive in a world that didn't care about human comfort or convenience. Christmas came and went unmarked except for Bill opening a small bottle of whiskey he'd been saving. We drank it slowly, savouring each sip, and talked about families and homes that seemed as distant as the moon. January brought the worst cold I'd ever experienced. For 3 weeks, the temperature never rose above 0. Our water barrel froze solid despite being inside the cabin. We had to melt snow for drinking water, and every trip to check our snares became an exercise in survival. The cold was like nothing I'd ever imagined. It wasn't just the absence of warmth. It was an active, malevolent presence that seemed to seek out every weakness in our defences. The air itself became painful to breathe, searing your lungs with each inhalation. Your nostrils froze shut within minutes of stepping outside, and your eyes watered tears that turned to ice before they could fall. 40 below, Bill said one morning, checking his primitive thermometer, a bottle of whiskey that froze at a known temperature. Maybe colder. At those temperatures, the world became alien. Metal burned like fire when you touched it with bare skin. Wood became brittle, snapping with sounds like gunshots when the frost got into it. The very air seemed to crystallize, forming ice fog that hung in the forest like something from a dream. Our cabin, which had seemed reasonably comfortable in November, became a desperate refuge against forces that could kill you in minutes. We kept the fire burning continuously, feeding it with wood we'd stockpiled throughout the fall. But even with the fire roaring, the temperature inside never rose much above 40 degrees, and that was only near the fireplace. The walls, chinked though they were, conducted cold like metal. Ice formed on the inside surface despite our best efforts to keep warm air circulating. Our bedding became stiff with frost each night, and we learned to sleep fully clothed, sharing body heat under every blanket and hide we possessed. Water was a constant concern. We'd learned to keep a pot on the fire at all times, melting snow for drinking, cooking, and the occasional luxury of washing. But snow contains surprisingly little water when melted. It took armloads of snow to produce a single pot of water, and gathering it meant venturing into cold that could freeze exposed flesh in under 5 minutes. The trips to check our snares became epic expeditions despite covering distances that would have been trivial in summer. We'd bundle up in every piece of clothing we owned, wrap our faces in strips of wool and hide, and venture out into a world that looked more like the surface of the moon than anything earthly. The snow was deep enough to swallow a man completely, and walking through it required snowshoes that Bill had crafted from ashwood and rawhide. Even with snowshoes, each step was an effort, and the exertion left us sweating inside our heavy clothes, a dangerous condition when sweat could freeze against your skin. Our snare line extended maybe half a mile from the cabin, but checking it could take the better part of a day in those conditions. We moved slowly, carefully, checking each snare for sign of rabbits or ptarmigan, resetting those that had been disturbed by wind or wildlife. The animals we caught were frozen solid by the time we found them, their bodies rigid as statues. We'd carry them back to the cabin wrapped in spare clothing to prevent our own body heat from thawing them prematurely. Frozen meat could be stored indefinitely in winter conditions, but thawed meat spoiled quickly even in cold weather. But there were rewards too. The forest in deep winter possessed a beauty that was almost supernatural. Snow loaded the branches of pine and fir until they drooped like the arms of dancers, creating cathedral-like spaces beneath. Sunlight, when it managed to penetrate the perpetual overcast, turned individual snowflakes into diamonds scattered across the landscape. The silence was profound, not just quiet, but absolutely, completely still. Sound travelled differently in the cold, seeming to come from unexpected directions or not at all. Our own voices, when we spoke outside, sounded strange and foreign, as if the words were being frozen before they could reach our ears. And at night, when the sky was clear, the stars burned with an intensity that made them seem close enough to touch. The northern lights painted the heavens in curtains of green and blue and purple, dancing across the darkness in displays that left us standing outside despite the killing cold, too amazed to care about the danger. At those temperatures, exposed skin froze in minutes, breathing hurt, metal burned when you touched it. The forest around us cracked and popped with sounds like gunshots as trees split from the cold. The worst part wasn't the immediate discomfort. It was the way the cold penetrated everything. Our food froze so hard it had to be thawed by the fire before we could eat it. Our tools became brittle and dangerous to use. Our clothes stiffened into armor-like shells that cracked when we moved, but we survived. We lived on preserved meat, dried berries, and the occasional rabbit or ptarmigan that Bill snared near the cabin. We told stories, played card games with a deck so worn the faces were barely visible, and learned things about each other that come only with shared hardship. I learned that Bill had a wife and daughter back in Missouri, that he'd been a soldier in the War of 1812, that he'd once killed a man in a knife fight over a card game. He learned that I'd run away from an apprenticeship I hated, that I was afraid of deep water, that I wrote poetry in a journal I thought I'd hidden successfully. The stories Bill told during those long winter nights painted a picture of a life lived on the edges of civilization, always moving between the wild and the settled, never quite belonging fully to either world. He'd fought at the Battle of New Orleans under Andrew Jackson, seen the British fleet bombarding American positions while he crouched in muddy trenches with a musket that misfired more often than it fired. War's different from what the newspapers make it sound like, he said one particularly cold evening when the wind was howling outside our cabin like a living thing. Mostly it's boredom and discomfort. with occasional moments of pure terror thrown in to keep you awake. After the war, he'd tried farming in Missouri, married a woman named Sarah who'd grown up on the frontier and understood the restlessness that drove men like him. But domestic life had felt like a cage after the excitement of military service, and when he heard about opportunities in the fur trade, the call of the wilderness had proved irresistible. "Sarah knew I'd leave eventually," he said, staring into the fire with the eyes that seemed to see far beyond the cabin walls. "Smart woman, my Sarah," she said. "Go get it out of your system, but come back to me whole." That was 15 years ago. He sent money back when he could, through the network of traders and suppliers that connected the mountains to civilization. Every few years, he'd make the long journey back to Missouri, spending a month or two with his family before the mountains called him back. "Little Mary was barely walking when I left," he said. "She's a woman grown now, probably married, maybe with children of her own. Sometimes I wonder if she remembers her daddy at all." The sadness in his voice was something I'd never heard before, a glimpse of the human cost of the mountain man life that the adventure stories never mentioned. For every man who found freedom in the wilderness, there was a family left behind, a price paid by people who never chose the life but bore its consequences anyway. My own story seemed simple by comparison. The son of a shopkeeper in St. Louis, I'd been apprenticed to the blacksmith more to get me out of my father's store than from any aptitude for metalwork. Peterson was a good man and a skilled craftsman, but the work felt like prison to someone who'd grown up reading adventure stories and dreaming of distant places. "My father wanted me to be respectable," I told Bill one night when the conversation had turned to our lives before the mountains. "Steady job, steady income. Maybe take over the shop someday and raise my own family of respectable citizens." "Nothing wrong with respectable," Bill said. But there was something in his tone that suggested he understood why respectable hadn't been enough for me. The poetry was harder to explain. I'd started writing verses as a boy, capturing moments and feelings that seemed too important to trust to memory alone. The journal I kept was filled with attempts to capture the beauty and terror of mountain life in words, though I doubted my efforts came close to the reality. Bill discovered it one day when he was looking for something in my pack and the journal fell out. I expected mockery. Poetry wasn't exactly considered a manly pursuit among frontier types, but instead he'd asked me to read some of it aloud. "Words matter," he said, after listening to a piece I'd written about watching sunrise from a mountain peak. "Most folks think because we live rough, we don't appreciate beauty, but we see more of it than city people ever do. We just don't usually try to capture it." That acceptance meant more to me than I could express. In St. Louis, my poetry had been seen as evidence of an impractical nature, a waste of time that interfered with more serious pursuits. Here in the mountains, it became a way of processing experiences that were often too intense for casual conversation. The knife fight Bill had mentioned was something he talked about only once, and then reluctantly. It had happened at a rendezvous several years earlier, when a trapper named McCready had accused Bill of jumping his claim and stealing furs from his trap line. McCready was drunk, Bill said, but that don't excuse what happened. He came at me with a knife, calling me a thief in front of half the camp. "Man says that about you in public. You got to answer it or your reputation's finished." The fight had been brief but vicious. McCready was younger and probably stronger, but Bill had more experience and better judgment. When it was over, McCready was dead and Bill was carved up but alive. "Killed a man over furs that probably weren't even stolen," Bill said, his voice heavy with regret. Turned out McCready had just forgotten where he'd set his traps. Found them 3 days later, exactly where he'd left them. The incident had haunted Bill ever since, Not because he'd acted wrongly. Frontier justice demanded that he defend his reputation, but because it had been so unnecessary, so wasteful of human life. That's when I learned to walk away from fights when I could, he said. Pride's a luxury you can't always afford out here. These conversations, spread across the long winter nights, created a bond between us that went far beyond the practical partnership of trapping. We became friends in the deepest sense, men who understood each other's strengths and weaknesses, fears and hopes, failures and dreams. The isolation that had initially felt like a burden gradually became a gift. Time to think, to process the experiences of the past months, to plan for an uncertain future. Without the distractions of civilization, conversation became deeper, more meaningful, more honest than anything I'd experienced in town. February brought the first hints that spring might someday return. The days grew longer, almost imperceptibly. The cold remained brutal, but there were moments, an hour here and there, when the sun had actual warmth to it. And then came the morning that changed everything. I woke to the sound of voices outside the cabin. Not the usual sounds of wind or wildlife, but actual human voices speaking in English. Bill was already awake, rifle in hand, motioning for silence. Through the small window we could see 3 men approaching through the snow. They looked like us, bearded, dressed in buckskins, carrying the gear of the mountain men. "Hello, the cabin," one of them called. "We're friendly." Bill relaxed slightly but kept his rifle ready. "State your business." "Name's Carson, Kit Carson. We're looking for old Bill." Bill's expression changed completely. "Kit? That you ornery bastard?" He threw open the door, and suddenly our tiny cabin was filled with 3 more mountain men, stamping snow off their boots and bringing with them the smell of the trail, wood smoke, and unwashed humanity. Kit Carson turned out to be a small, quiet man with eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His companions were Joe Walker and Dick Sublette, names that meant nothing to me then but would become legendary in frontier history. "Thought you were dead," Carson said to Bill, accepting a cup of coffee and settling by our fire. "Nobody's seen hide nor hair of you since last rendezvous." "Been keeping busy," Bill replied, "teaching this greenhorn how not to die." Carson looked me over with professional assessment. "Looks like he's learning." They'd come with news from the outside world, politics, prices, gossip from the trading posts. But more importantly, they brought word of the spring rendezvous. "Pierre's Hole," Carson said. "July. Company's buying all the beaver they can get. Prices are good." For the next 3 days, our cabin was transformed into a social hub. These men hadn't seen each other for months, and they had stories to share, news to exchange, and serious drinking to catch up on. I listened, fascinated as they talked about places I'd never heard of. The Snake River country, the Green River Valley, the mysterious territory beyond the Rockies where rivers flowed west to the Pacific Ocean. "Country out there," Walker said. "That makes this look tame. Deserts that'll cook a man in summer, mountains that make these look like hills, rivers that disappear into the ground and come up 100 miles away." "You been there?" I asked. Walker nodded. "Last year. Followed a river clear to the ocean. Country's got everything. Furs, gold maybe, land that'd grow anything if a man could get water to it." When they left, continuing south toward their own winter quarters, our cabin felt impossibly empty. But they'd left us with something more valuable than company, hope for the future and plans for spring. March brought the first real thaw, and with it the return of wildlife to our valley. We heard wolves howling again, saw deer tracks in the snow, found fresh beaver sign along the river. "Time to start thinking about moving," Bill said one morning as we watched water dripping from icicles outside our door. But before we could leave our winter refuge, we had one more challenge to face. I woke one night to the sound of something large moving around outside the cabin. Not careful movement like a human might make, but the heavy, deliberate progress of something that didn't need to worry about predators. "Bear," Bill whispered, already reaching for his rifle. "Big one," from the sound. Through the window, we could see a massive grizzly investigating our storage cache, where we'd hung our remaining meat high in a tree. The bear was enormous, 7 feet tall at the shoulder when it reared up on its hind legs, easily 600 pounds of muscle, claws, and appetite. "What do we do?" I whispered. "Wait," Bill said simply, "and hope it moves on." But the bear had found our meat, and it wasn't inclined to leave. For the next hour we listened to it destroying our cache, tearing down everything we'd carefully stored for the spring journey. "Son of a bitch," Bill muttered as we heard the distinctive sound of our last bacon being consumed. That was supposed to last us to rendezvous. When morning came, the bear was gone, but so was most of our food. Our carefully planned departure would now be a race against starvation. "We leave today," Bill said, surveying the destruction. "Take what we can carry, cache the rest, and hope we can live off the land until we reach other trappers." Packing everything we owned into 2 large packs was an exercise in brutal prioritization. The beaver pelts came first. They were our ticket to survival. Tools and weapons next. Food and spare clothing last, and only what we could physically carry. By noon, we were ready to leave the cabin that had been our home for 4 months. I looked back once as we started down the valley, but Bill kept moving forward. "Don't look back," he said without turning around. "Ain't nothing there for us now." The journey to rendezvous took 6 weeks of the hardest travelling I'd ever done. Springer's mountains meant mud, swollen rivers, and weather that changed hourly from sunshine to snow to torrential rain. The snow was melting everywhere at once, turning every stream into a torrent and every valley floor into a bog. What had been solid, frozen ground during winter became treacherous footing that could trap a man up to his knees or swallow a pack animal completely. We lost one of our pack animals, a sturdy mule that had carried supplies faithfully through the winter, when it stepped off what we thought was solid ground into a hidden sinkhole. The animal disappeared so quickly there was no time to react, vanishing beneath muddy water that closed over it without a trace. "Quicksand," Bill said grimly, testing the ground around the spot with a long stick. "Ground looks solid, but underneath it's nothing but water and silt. Mule probably never knew what hit him." The loss of the mule meant redistributing our load among the remaining animals and ourselves, adding weight to packs that were already at the limit of what we could reasonably carry. Every item had to be evaluated and prioritized. Essential survival gear first, trade goods second, personal items last. I had to abandon most of my spare clothing and several books I'd carried since leaving St. Louis. Watching those possessions disappear into the mud felt like losing pieces of my old identity, the civilized young man who'd thought he could bring city comforts into the wilderness. River crossings became epic undertakements requiring careful planning and considerable risk. Streams that had been ankle-deep in autumn were now raging torrents that could sweep away a horse and rider. We spent entire days searching for safe crossing points, sometimes backtracking miles to find a place where the current was manageable. Bill constructed an improvised raft for our most valuable possessions, the beaver pelts, and essential trade goods that represented our year's earnings. The raft was crude but functional, made from deadfall logs lashed together with rope and sealed with pine pitch. "Lose those pelts," he said as we prepared for a particularly dangerous crossing, "and we've spent a year in the mountains for nothing." The crossing took most of a day. We ferried our goods across in multiple trips, swimming our animals behind us while fighting currents that threatened to carry us downstream into white water that would have meant certain death. I nearly drowned during the third crossing when my horse stumbled in midstream and went under, taking me with it. The shock of the cold water, the weight of my pack, and the panic of being dragged downstream by a thrashing animal combined to create a moment of pure terror. Bill appeared beside me like a guardian angel, grabbing my pack and hauling me toward shore while shouting instructions I couldn't hear over the roar of the water. When we finally reached solid ground, I was blue with cold and coughing up river water, but alive. First rule of mountain travel, Bill said as I recovered, is don't die doing something stupid. River crossings kill more trappers than Indians and bears combined. The weather was equally challenging. Spring storms in the high country were violent, unpredictable affairs that could turn a pleasant morning into a fight for survival. We were caught in hailstorms that pelted us with ice stones the size of bird eggs, windstorms that flattened our shelter and scattered our gear, and sudden blizzards that dropped temperatures 40 degrees in as many minutes. Food remained a constant concern. We were travelling through country that had been trapped heavily, and game was scarce. The preserved meat we'd brought from our winter quarters was running low, and finding fresh food required time and energy we could barely spare from the demands of travel. Bill's knowledge of edible plants became crucial to our survival. He showed me which roots could be dug and eaten raw, which berries were safe despite being unripe, which tree bark could be processed into emergency rations. Cattail roots, he said, pulling up plants from a marshy area near our evening camp. Taste like potatoes if you cook them right. Rich in calories, easy to digest. We ate dandelion greens, wild onions, and pine needle tea. A diet that would have seemed like starvation fare back in St. Louis, but which kept us functional during the hardest part of our journey. The pine needle tea was particularly important for preventing scurvy, though I didn't understand the medical reasons at the time. Bill just knew that trappers who drank it regularly stayed healthier than those who didn't. Another piece of practical wisdom passed down through generations of wilderness experience. Wildlife encounters were more frequent during spring travel, as animals emerged from winter hiding places and began moving to summer ranges. We saw wolves, bears, mountain cats, and elk in numbers that dwarfed anything I'd experienced during winter. Most encounters were brief and harmless, animals that saw or smelled us and moved away before we were aware of their presence. But some required careful navigation, particularly when we encountered protective mothers with young offspring. A female grizzly with cubs blocked our path for most of one afternoon, refusing to move despite our efforts to find alternate routes. We eventually had to backtrack several miles and take a longer route around her territory, losing half a day of travel time but avoiding what could have been a fatal confrontation. "Never get between a mother and her babies," Bill said, as we watched the bear family from a safe distance. "Don't matter if it's a deer or a grizzly, protective instinct makes them dangerous." The human encounters were equally challenging. We met other trappers heading to rendezvous, some friendly and willing to share information, others suspicious and hostile. Competition for the best routes and campsites could create tensions that escalated quickly in the isolation of the wilderness. One group of trappers tried to claim that we were traveling through their exclusive territory and demanded payment for passage. Bill handled the confrontation with diplomatic skill, neither backing down nor escalating to violence, eventually convincing them that the mountains belonged to no one and that passage rights weren't theirs to sell. But the experience reminded us that human dangers were as real as natural ones, and that the civilized world's systems of law and order didn't extend into the wilderness. We lived on whatever we could find or catch, fish when we could get them, small game when Bill's snares worked, edible plants as they began to emerge from winter dormancy. There were days when we ate nothing at all, and nights when we slept in wet bedrolls under dripping trees, but we made it. On a warm day in early July, we crested a ridge and looked down into Pierre's Hole, where the annual rendezvous was already in full swing. The sight was something to behold. Hundreds of men scattered across a valley floor, teepees and lean-tos and rough shelters, horses and mules grazing in meadows, smoke from countless fires rising into the clear mountain air. Pierre's Hole was a natural amphitheatre, a broad valley surrounded by towering peaks that provided shelter from winds and plenty of water and grass for the animals. For 2 weeks each summer, it became the unofficial capital of the fur trade, a place where mountain men, company agents, traders, and friendly Indians gathered to conduct the business that kept them alive for another year. The scale of it was overwhelming after months of seeing no one but Bill. There were at least 300 men spread across the valley floor, maybe more. Mountain men in buckskin still stiff with winter grime, company men in relatively clean wool and cotton, traders with pack trains of supplies, Delaware and Iroquois trappers who worked for the big companies, even a few families of Nez Perce and Flathead Indians who came to trade horses and furs. The noise! After months of silence broken only by wind and water, the sound of human voices, laughter, arguments, singing, and trading was almost overwhelming. Conversations in English, French, Spanish, and half a dozen Indian languages created a constant babble that rose and fell like waves on a beach. The smells were equally intense. Wood smoke from hundreds of fires, roasting meat, unwashed bodies, leather and fur, horse manure, and the sharp scent of alcohol carried on every breeze. It was sensory overload after the clean, simple smells of the winter mountains. But it was also civilization of a sort. The first human contact we'd had in over 6 months. The first opportunity to trade our furs for the supplies we'd need for another year in the wilderness. And for me, it was the first chance to see if I'd truly become a mountain man, or if I was still just a city boy playing at frontier life. The organization of Rendezvous was deceptively casual. There was no formal structure, no appointed leaders, no official schedule. Men simply arrived when they could get there and set up camp wherever they found space. But beneath the apparent chaos was a complex web of relationships, debts, partnerships, and rivalries that governed everything that happened. The fur companies, American Fur Company, Rocky Mountain Fur Company, and the smaller outfits, had the prime locations near water and grass. Their camps were the most elaborate, with canvas tents, folding tables, and supplies arranged in neat rows. These were the men with capital, the ones who could afford to transport goods hundreds of miles into the wilderness and sell them at prices that made individual trappers rich or poor, depending on how successful their season had been. Individual trappers and small partnerships like Bill and me set up wherever we could find space. Our camps were simple affairs, a lean-to or small tent, a fire ring, our possessions spread out on hides or canvas. We were the producers in this economy, the men who did the actual work of trapping beaver. But we were also the most vulnerable to the fluctuations of supply and demand. Then there were the traders, men who specialized in moving goods between the mountains and civilization, who knew which routes were safe and which were controlled by hostile tribes, who could calculate the risks of weather and warfare against the potential profits of successful trade. They were the middlemen, and like middlemen everywhere, they took their cut of every transaction. The Indian camps were separate but integrated into the larger economy. The Nez Perce and Flathead were traditional allies of American trappers, providing horses, buffalo robes, and information about tribal movements in exchange for manufactured goods. but even friendly tribes were careful to maintain their own identity and interests. Trading began almost immediately upon arrival. Furs were graded, weighed, and appraised by company buyers who'd seen thousands of pelts and could spot quality or defects from across a camp. Prime beaver pelts were bringing $5 to $6 each that year, a good price that reflected the continued demand for beaver felt hats in eastern cities. But the prices of goods were equally inflated. Coffee that cost 20 cents a pound in St. Louis was selling for $2 at Rendezvous. Sugar was $3 a pound. Gunpowder, lead, knives, traps, everything carried the premium of wilderness transportation and risk. "Welcome to civilization," Bill said, with what might have been irony. Such as it is. The trading process itself was a complex dance of negotiation, evaluation, and relationship building. A man's reputation mattered as much as the quality of his furs. Trappers who were known to be reliable, honest, and skilled could command better prices and more favorable terms than unknowns or men with questionable reputations. Bill, I discovered, was well regarded among both company men and fellow trappers. His furs were always prime quality, his word was good, and he'd never been known to cheat a partner or welch on a debt. That reputation translated into real financial benefits, better prices for our furs, access to higher quality supplies, and credit when we needed it. The social aspects of Rendezvous were as important as the business. After months of isolation, men craved human contact, news from the outside world, and the simple pleasure of conversation with people who understood their way of life. Stories were told and retold, growing more elaborate with each telling. Achievements were celebrated, losses mourned, and plans made for the coming year. Competition was intense but generally friendly. Men competed in shooting contests, horse races, wrestling matches, and various tests of wilderness skills. These weren't just entertainment. They were ways of establishing hierarchy and reputation within the community, of proving that you belonged among the elite of mountain men. The next week was a whirlwind of activity. We sold our beaver pelts to company representatives, getting good prices for prime furs. I watched in amazement as men who'd been isolated for months traded everything they owned, drank away their earnings, gambled for stakes that could mean life or death, and made plans for the coming year. It was here that I met the legends of the mountain man era. Jim Bridger, who could tell stories that stretched truth until it snapped back. Hugh Glass, who'd crawled 300 miles after being mauled by a grizzly. John Coulter, who'd run naked through Blackfeet country and lived to tell about it. Meeting these men was like encountering living myths. Their reputations preceded them, whispered around campfires and trading posts from the Missouri River to the Pacific coast. But seeing them in person was something else entirely. Ordinary-looking men who'd done extraordinary things, whose very presence carried the weight of legend. Jim Bridger was maybe 40 years old, shorter than I'd expected, with eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He'd been in the mountains for nearly 20 years, longer than almost anyone, and knew the western country better than most men knew their own farms. He could navigate by stars, read weather patterns days in advance, and speak half a dozen Indian languages fluently. But what made Bridger famous was his storytelling. He had a gift for taking real events and embellishing them until they became something between history and mythology. He'd tell you about geysers that shot boiling water 100 feet into the air, about glass mountains that were actually volcanic obsidian, about petrified forests where the trees, the birds, and even the songs they sang were turned to stone. Most Eastern folks who heard these stories figured Bridger was lying, but those of us who'd seen the actual wonders of the Western country knew better. The truth was strange enough that fiction barely had to stretch to sound impossible. Hugh Glass was a different sort of legend entirely. He was maybe 50, scarred and weathered, with the kind of quiet intensity that made you pay attention when he spoke. His fame came from what was simply known as the crawl, a feat of endurance that had entered mountain man folklore. 3 years earlier, Glass had been mauled by a grizzly bear while exploring the Grand River country. The bear had torn open his back, broken his ribs, and left him for dead. His companions, convinced he couldn't survive, had taken his rifle and knife and left him with nothing but the clothes on his back. Glass had crawled and walked 300 miles back to civilization, living on berries, roots, and carrion, setting his own broken bones, and somehow avoiding infection despite wounds that should have killed him. When he finally reached Fort Kiowa, the men who'd abandoned him thought they were seeing a ghost. The remarkable thing about Glass wasn't just that he'd survived. It was that he'd forgiven the men who'd left him. When he finally tracked them down, instead of seeking revenge, he simply asked for his rifle back. That kind of character was rare even among mountain men, who were generally known for settling scores with interest. John Coulter represented a different kind of legend, the man who'd seen more of the unknown country than anyone else alive. He'd been with Lewis and Clark, had explored the Yellowstone region before anyone knew it existed, and had survived encounters with hostile Indians that should have killed him a dozen times over. Coulter's most famous escape had happened just a few years earlier, when he'd been captured by Blackfeet near the Three Forks of the Missouri. They'd stripped him naked, given him a head start, and then pursued him like hunters chasing game. Coulter had outrun the entire war party, hidden in a beaver dam for hours while they searched for him, and then walked 300 miles to safety without clothes, weapons, or food. But what struck me about these legendary figures wasn't their individual exploits. It was how normal they seemed in person. They weren't superhuman beings, just men who'd been tested by extreme circumstances and had found ways to survive. They had the same concerns as any other trapper: good furs, fair prices, reliable partners, and enough luck to see another season. Bridger worried about his aging joints and wondered how many more winters he could handle in the high country. Glass talked about the ache in his back where the bear had clawed him and how it got worse each year. Coulter had settled down with a wife and was thinking about farming, tired of the constant danger and uncertainty of mountain life. That was perhaps the most sobering realization of Rendezvous, seeing that even legends grew old, that the mountain man life was ultimately unsustainable for any individual. The country might be eternal, but the men who challenged it were mortal, and time was undefeated in its long war against human ambition. There were younger men too, recent arrivals full of enthusiasm and romantic notions about mountain life. They reminded me of myself just a year earlier, so confident in their abilities, so certain that they were different from all the men who'd failed before them. Some of them might survive long enough to become legends themselves. Most would be dead within a year. The drinking was legendary too, and not in a good way. Men who'd been sober for months could put away astonishing quantities of alcohol in a few days, making up for lost time with a dedication that bordered on self-destruction. Fights were common, usually over cards or women or imagined slights that would have been forgotten in more sober circumstances. I watched grown men gamble away their entire year's earnings on the turn of a card, then borrow against next year's prospects to keep playing. Others spent fortunes on trinkets and luxuries they didn't need, simply because they could. The boom and bust cycle of Rendezvous was a perfect microcosm of the entire fur trade. brief periods of prosperity followed by long stretches of hardship and deprivation. But there was also genuine camaraderie, the kind that comes from shared experience in a profession where your life often depends on the man next to you. Partnerships were formed, dissolved, and reformed with handshakes and verbal agreements that carried more weight than most written contracts. Information was shared freely, which streams were trapped out, where hostile tribes had been seen, which passes were still blocked by snow. The women at Rendezvous were few but influential. Indian wives of trappers, traders' daughters, and the occasional adventurous woman from the settlements brought different perspectives to the overwhelmingly male gathering. They conducted their own business, trading beadwork and hide products for manufactured goods, serving as cultural interpreters between Swite and Indian communities. Some of the most successful traders were women who understood both worlds and could navigate the complex relationships that governed frontier commerce. They were often the ones who knew which tribes were friendly, which routes were safe, and how to negotiate deals that satisfied all parties. As the days passed, I found myself changing in ways I hadn't expected. The shy, uncertain young man who'd arrived at Rendezvous was being replaced by someone more confident, more comfortable in his own skin. I could hold my own in conversations with experienced trappers, contribute to discussions about routes and techniques, and command a certain respect for having survived a full season in the mountains. But it was also here that I learned the end was coming. Fashion's changing back east, a company man told us over drinks one evening. Silk hats are the thing now. Beaver's still selling, but not like it was. Give it 5 years, maybe 10, and this whole business will be done. The news hit the gathering like a physical blow. Men who'd risked everything for the chance to make their fortune in the fur trade suddenly faced the possibility that their entire way of life was becoming obsolete. The market forces that had created the mountain man era were shifting, driven by changes in fashion and technology that seemed as distant and incomprehensible as the politics of foreign nations. The silk hat represented more than just a change in style. It was a symbol of industrial progress that was making handcrafted goods obsolete. Machines could now produce hat felt from other materials more cheaply and consistently than the traditional beaver felt that had driven the fur trade for decades. Been seeing it coming for a while, admitted Thomas Fitzpatrick, one of the most successful traders at the gathering. Orders are down, prices are soft, and the big Eastern manufacturers are switching to new processes that don't require beaver pelts. For men like Bill, who'd spent the better part of their adult lives mastering the skills of wilderness survival and fur trading, the implications were staggering. Their expertise was becoming worthless not because they'd failed, but because the world was changing in ways they couldn't control or influence. The psychological impact was as devastating as the economic reality. These weren't men who adapted easily to change. They'd found their place in the world through years of hard experience, and that place was disappearing beneath their feet. Some of the older trappers talked about retirement, about returning to families they'd left behind or settling in places like Oregon, where land was still cheap and opportunities might exist for men with wilderness skills. But others, especially those who'd been in the mountains for decades, couldn't imagine any other life. "What's a man like me supposed to do in a world of silk hats and steam engines?" asked Joe Meek, a trapper who'd been working the western mountains since before I was born. "I can track a elk through country that'd kill most men, but I don't know the first thing about running a store or working in a factory." The conversation that night grew darker as men contemplated futures that seemed to offer nothing but decline and displacement. These were people who'd chosen the mountain life partly because it represented freedom from the constraints and complications of civilization, and now civilization was reaching out to reclaim them whether they wanted it or not. But there was also a defiant spirit among some of the gathering, a refusal to accept that their way of life was finished just because Eastern fashion had changed. They talked about new opportunities, trading in buffalo robes, guiding wagon trains, exploring territories that were still unmapped and unclaimed. "Country's still here," declared Kit Carson, his quiet voice carrying unusual force. "Animals are still here. People back east still need things that come from out here. Market might be changing, but that don't mean it's disappearing." Carson's optimism was infectious, but it couldn't completely overcome the reality that the great era of the mountain man was drawing to a close. The economic foundation of the fur trade was crumbling, and no amount of courage or skill could rebuild it. The younger men at Rendezvous talked about California, where reports suggested new opportunities might exist for people willing to work hard and take risks. Others discussed Oregon, where the government was offering land grants to settlers who could survive the overland journey. Bill took this news with his usual stoicism, but I could see it hit him hard. This life, this trade, this freedom, it was all temporary, built on the whims of fashion and the appetites of distant markets. The realization that we were witnesses to the end of an era added poignancy to every aspect of Rendezvous. The competitions, the trading, the storytelling, all of it felt like a farewell celebration, a last gathering of men who would soon scatter to pursue whatever opportunities remained in a changing world. "What then?" I asked him later as we sat by our fire watching the raucous celebration around us. "Then we find something else," he said simply. "That's what men do, adapt or die." But I could see in his eyes that he knew something was ending, something that could never be replaced. When Rendezvous broke up, Bill and I went our separate ways. He headed back into the mountains for one more season, maybe two. I took my earnings and my new skills and headed for California, where word had it there were opportunities for men who weren't afraid of hard work and harder country. The decision to part ways wasn't easy. Bill had become more than a mentor. He was the closest thing to a father I'd known since leaving home. He'd taught me not just how to survive in the wilderness, but how to think like a mountain man, how to read the signs that most men missed, how to adapt to whatever the country threw at you. But I could see that his time in the mountains was drawing to a close. He was maybe 55, old for a man in that profession, and the years were starting to show. His joints ached on cold mornings, his eyes weren't quite as sharp as they'd once been, and he moved with the careful deliberation of a man who knew his margin for error was shrinking. "Time for you to make your own way," he said as we divided our remaining supplies. "You know enough now to keep yourself alive, and that's more than most men can say." He was right, though I didn't feel ready. The mountain man life was like that. You never felt completely prepared for what came next, because the country kept changing, presenting new challenges that demanded fresh solutions. The key was to stay flexible, to learn from every experience, and to never let confidence turn into complacency. My journey to California took 3 months of hard traveling through country that made the Rockies look hospitable. I crossed deserts that could cook a man in summer, mountains that scraped the sky, and rivers that appeared and disappeared like mirages. I nearly died of thirst in Nevada, nearly froze in the Sierra Nevada, and nearly starved in the San Joaquin Valley. But I made it, and the skills Bill had taught me were what saved me. I could read weather signs, find water in unlikely places, and live off the land when my supplies ran out. More importantly, I could think like a survivor. making the kind of hard decisions that kept you alive when easier choices might get you killed. California in 1832 was a land of opportunity for men with wilderness skills. The hide and tallow trade was booming. Cattle ranches needed men who could work in rough country, and there were always expeditions forming to explore the interior valleys and mountain ranges. I found work with various outfits, using my mountain experience to guide parties through dangerous country. But something was missing. The camaraderie of men facing shared danger, the satisfaction of mastering skills that most people never dreamed of needing, the clarity that came from living in a place where every decision mattered. None of that existed in California's more civilized pursuits. I tried other frontiers over the years. I was in Oregon during the early settlement period, in Colorado during the mining boom, in Montana when the cattle business was just getting started. Each place offered its own challenges and rewards, but none quite captured the intensity of those months in the Rockies with Old Bill. Maybe it was the times. The 1830s were the peak of the mountain man era, when the country was still truly wild and men could disappear into it for years at a time. By the 1840s, wagon trains were crossing the continent regularly. The telegraph was connecting distant cities, and the wild places were becoming mapped and tamed. Or maybe it was just youth. At 22, everything feels more intense, more meaningful, more significant than it will at 40 or 60. The challenges that seemed so monumental in 1831 might have been just another day's work to an older, more experienced man. I never saw Bill again, though I heard stories over the years. Some said he'd settled down in Oregon. Others claimed he'd died in a blizzard in the Tetons. A few swore they'd seen him in California during the gold rush, still wearing buckskins and still carrying that old rifle. The most persistent story was that he'd married an Indian woman and moved north into British Columbia, where he spent his final years trapping and trading in country so remote that white men rarely ventured there. I'd like to think that was true, that he found peace in the wilderness that had been his home for so long. I'd like to think he found his way to whatever comes after some mountain man life. He'd earned it, and more. As for me, I spent the rest of my life chasing that feeling I'd had in the mountains, the clarity that comes from facing real danger, the satisfaction of skills hard won, the brotherhood forged in shared hardship. I never found it again, not completely. Civilization, for all its comforts, lacks that sharp edge that makes a man truly alive. But I came close a few times, in other wilderness places, with other hard men facing other challenges. I guided wagon trains across the Oregon Trail, survived the California Gold Rush, fought in the Mexican War, and helped survey the Transcontinental Railroad. Each experience taught me something new about survival, about leadership, about the strange ways that ordinary men can rise to extraordinary occasions. But the lessons I learned from Old Bill remained the foundation of everything else. The importance of preparation, of reading the signs that others missed, of staying calm in crisis situations, the value of honest partnerships, of keeping your word even when it cost you, of helping others even when you gained nothing from it. Most importantly, he taught me that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about maintaining your humanity in circumstances that strip away everything non-essential. It's easy to become an animal when you're hungry, cold, and afraid. The real challenge is remaining a man, and sometimes, on cold mornings when the world is still and quiet, I can close my eyes and be back in that wiki-up with Old Bill, listening to the snowfall and knowing that if we can just make it through one more day, we'll have accomplished something that matters. The mountain men are gone now, of course. The beaver came back, the wilderness was mapped and tamed, and the world moved on to other frontiers, other challenges. But something was lost when they disappeared, a kind of self-reliance, a willingness to face the unknown with nothing but skill and courage. The modern world has its own challenges, its own tests of character and endurance, but they're different somehow, more abstract, more removed from the fundamental business of staying alive. We've gained much in comfort and safety, but we've lost something too. The knowledge that human beings are capable of incredible things when necessity demands it. Maybe that's why I tell this story all these years later. Not just to remember what was, but to remind people of what's possible when ordinary men decide to do extraordinary things. The wilderness is still out there, waiting. And somewhere in the mountains, if you know how to look, you can still find traces of the men who made them home. A tumbled cabin foundation, a rusty trap half buried in stream sediment, initials carved in aspen bark by someone who wanted to leave proof that they'd been there, that they'd survived, that they'd lived fully in a place that demanded everything and gave back just enough to keep a man alive. I found one of those campsites a few years ago while exploring a remote valley in Montana. There wasn't much left, a fire ring, some scattered bones from long ago meals, a few pieces of rusted metal that might once have been traps or tools. But there was something else too, carved into the bark of an ancient cottonwood tree. Old Bill, 1834. I stood there for a long time, running my fingers over those faded letters, wondering if this was where my old mentor had made his final camp. The tree had grown since then, the bark stretched and distorted, but the carving was still legible to someone who knew what to look for. That's the real treasure of the mountain men, not the beaver pelts or the gold they sometimes found, but the knowledge that human beings are capable of incredible adaptation, incredible courage, incredible endurance when the stakes are high enough and the cause is true enough. They proved that civilization isn't about comfort or convenience. It's about the choices we make when everything else is stripped away. It's about helping your partner even when you can barely help yourself. About keeping your word even when breaking it would be easier. About facing impossible odds with nothing but skill and determination. And if you listen carefully on quiet nights in wild places, you might still hear Old Bill's voice carrying on the wind. Days young, still plenty of time for dying. But also, if you listen even more carefully, you might hear the other message hidden in those words, the one that kept us going through the coldest nights and the hardest days. Tomorrow is another chance to prove you belong in this world, another opportunity to earn your place among the living. That's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're facing down a grizzly bear or just trying to make it through another day in whatever wilderness you call home. The mountains are eternal, but the men who challenged them were mortal. Their legacy isn't in the furs they trapped or the fortunes they made, but in the example they set, that human beings can adapt to any environment, overcome any obstacle, survive any hardship if they're willing to pay the price. In our modern world of climate control and instant communication, of GPS navigation and emergency services, it's easy to forget how recent and fragile our safety net really is. The mountain men lived without any of those things, and not only survived but thrived in conditions that would kill most of us in days. They remind us that we're tougher than we think, more capable than we know, more adaptable than we've been forced to prove. The comfortable world we've built for ourselves is a wonderful thing, but it shouldn't make us forget what we're capable of when comfort isn't available. Sometimes I wonder what Old Bill would think of the modern world, the cities that stretch for hundreds of miles, the machines that let us talk to people on the other side of the planet, the medicines that cure diseases that were death sentences in his time. I think he'd be amazed by the ingenuity, but maybe also a little sad about what we've lost. Because for all our technological marvels, we've become a people who are afraid of discomfort, who panic when the power goes out, who can't imagine surviving without the systems that support us. We've gained security but lost resilience, gained convenience but lost self-reliance. The mountain men would understand the trade-off. They were practical men who appreciated the value of tools and technology. But they'd also recognize the danger of becoming too dependent on things beyond your control. That's why their story matters, why it's worth telling even now, nearly 2 centuries later. Not because we should all abandon civilization and head for the mountains, but because we should remember what's possible when necessity demands it. The wilderness is still there, waiting to test anyone brave enough or foolish enough to accept its challenge. And in some ways, the modern world presents its own wilderness. Economic uncertainty, environmental changes, social upheaval that requires the same kinds of adaptability and resilience that the mountain men mastered. The specific skills they learned, how to trap beaver, how to read weather signs, how to survive in temperatures that would kill an unprepared man, those are mostly obsolete now. But the underlying principles they lived by are as relevant as ever. Be prepared, stay flexible, help your partners, and never give up when the odds are against you. Those are the lessons I carry with me from those months in the mountains with Old Bill. They've served me well through wars and depressions, through personal tragedies and professional failures, through all the smaller wilderness experiences that make up a human life. And sometimes, when the wind is just right and the world is quiet enough, I swear I can still hear his voice. Days young, boy, still plenty of time for living.